Questions about the readings?
Yeah, so there are, in a couple of the Webster readings, the idea that like you need software talent, which is not like developed, it's born. And that just kind of like, for me, like I feel like there are some like inclinations to make people better software owners, but like for me, in my experiences, it's a lot of experience. People I think, oh wow, they're really talented, they're really good. It's because they've been doing it for a lot longer than I have, and they've like enmeshed more inside at learning. And so like I'm just wondering where like your hard work, like where you think the line of like hard work and talent ties in. Because to me, I see a lot of it like with this stuff is just knowledge, and it's a lot of hard work, not so much talent.
Well, and it's right. In the reading you did, I had TEPIS: talent, experience,
right,
professionalism, education, and skills. And what you're looking for is a combination of those. It depends. I have worked with people who are extremely talented. I've known people who are extremely bright and talented and ended up getting fired.
Yeah.
Because they lack the professionalism and some of the discipline to actually do it. I actually once, I think, got myself passed over. I was between jobs, was interviewing for jobs, and went to a company that was actually a well-known software tools company, and was interviewing, and was told during one of my interviews with one of the other engineers that there were two younger people at the company who were very bright, very talented, but very much prima donnas. And that the company was being run basically their way or the highway. So when we got to a group interview, I rather deliberately made a reference. I was getting asked various questions about what do you consider most important and so on. I said, well, I think professionalism. I said, my experience is that working with prima donnas seldom works out well, and I saw a very distinct cloud come over their faces, and I was not made an offer or invited back, which didn't bother me. So the reason I stress talent is that, and I'm sure all of you have seen this, there's this big push. Everyone should learn how to code. Well, I think everyone should be exposed to coding, just like I think everyone should be exposed to music and to athletics. I was exposed to music. I won't, well, actually I will. I wanted to get into choir in high school. And normally you had to go to men's glee and then test out and be accepted in choir. My high school had one of the best choirs in California. And so I was going to, halfway through my sophomore year, join men's chorus, but to do so I had to get out of honors geometry. And Mrs. Pitkin, my honors geometry teacher, basically said, over my dead body, I'm putting you in regular geometry. Said, there's no way you should be, you should be anywhere but right here. And so she managed to convince Mr. Huber, the choir director, to let me straight into choir. Bless his heart, and especially bless Bruce Bastian's heart, because Bruce Bastian was the bass who sat next to me. I sat at the end of the second row basses. Bruce sat there, was one of the most talented musicians in choir, and he had to be because he had to keep his tune with me singing next to him. Choir was the hardest class I had in high school. Hardest class I had. It took me 3 semesters to work my way up to an A. It was also one of the best experiences in high school that I had, quite frankly. In fact, my 2 hardest classes in high school were choir and football, and frankly I was better at choir than I was at football. So I come to BYU, and my freshman year I think, I'm going to take an actual music theory class. And I signed up for music theory, whatever the music 105, music theory for non-music majors. And 2 weeks into it, I drop it. It is not sticking to my brain at all. It just is not sticking. Now, I still love to sing. In fact, I had another music class that semester, which was opera workshop, where we were in choruses and stuff like that. And so I actually performed a performance of Die Fledermaus here at BYU. But I performed as part of the chorus on the ballroom floor, not as a soloist or anything like that. And so there are millions of good, experienced craftspeople in information technology who know the subject, who know the tools, who have the skills, who have the experience. The problem is that we keep trying to, in my opinion, we keep trying to force people into programming who really have no aptitude, and when it boils down to it, they don't have much interest in it.
Right. That's a good thing.
And that's part of the issue here, and this gets back to the articles you read, the Real Software Crisis and Tempest, is that the demand far outstrips the supply of people who actually have any sort of inclination about it. And again, my point is the talent isn't a yes you have it, no you don't. It's you know, your stats in D&D or whatever. There are a number of different talents, and there's a range of skills in them. I've known people with these various different talents, and you know, in my own case, I consider myself talented, but I'm slow. In the sense that I've known programmers you could give a program to, and they would come back after a weekend with 10,000 lines of wonderfully working code that would do it. That's not me. I'm the type who surrounds myself with books and sits and thinks and thinks and thinks and thinks, and then comes up with extremely solid and well thought out architecture. Those are some of my talents. I'm also very, very good at debugging, at holding, you know, building that whole construct in my head. But I have known lots and lots of programmers who are way more talented than I am. And so it's you know, I have this issue come up every semester in the class, and I usually have some anxiety among my students. And my basic comment is, if you're a senior in computer science, don't worry. You would have been weeded out long ago if you really had no aptitude here. You would have just given up and changed majors, gone to something else. So you'll all do fine, trust me. The demand is out there. It's not like you're competing for PhD teaching spots in an ever-shrinking academic environment. Human civilization runs on information technology. And it needs every last one of you out there. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does. And I think what really resonated with me is the interest, because, like, I guess in my experience, like, I think if you would have been really interested in music theory, you maybe could have, like, picked that up and learned that. But, like, this wasn't something you weren't super excited about. And so, like,
well, it wasn't just super exciting. It just wasn't sticking to my brain.
Right.
I was looking at it. I have a daughter-in-law who's has a master's degree in music performance. And she and I joke about this, and there's a meme that I'm sure a lot of you have seen. One shows a music professor with some diagrams up on the board and saying, come on, this isn't rocket science. And then it shows a physicist with a bunch of stuff on, you know, an engineer with a bunch of stuff on the whiteboard saying, come on, this isn't music theory.
Yeah.
How many of you actually know music theory? And yeah, it's its own thing. And by the way, there tends to be a strong correlation between aptitude in software engineering and aptitude in music, but I don't have it. I work for every last bit. So yeah.
This wasn't in our readings, but there's a really cool book. We did a talk at Google, the authors did, called Trying to Perform.
Mm-hmm.
And one of their insights, just kind of piggybacking on what you said, is the motive of play. So if you go to work and you feel like you're playing, you can experiment and you know, do the coding equivalent of doodling and doing all of that, you're going to be one of the high performers because you have that innate desire to learn more about the craft versus being incentivized by a bonus.
Yeah.
Or
Did all of you hear that? Because it actually ties into something. I think I mentioned to you that when I graduated from BYU in 1978 with my BS in computer science, there were about 120 students in the program. When I came back to Provo in 1985, the department found out and said, will you come teach for us? And I thought, oh, this is so great, they love me. Well, no, what had happened was that in those 7 years, the program had gone from 120 students to 1,000 students. And if you actually look it up, you'll find there was a big peak in computer science enrollment right in 1985, so my timing was great. Sort of. Anyway. But at that point, you had to first take and pass 142 with a sufficiently good grade, and then apply and be accepted as a computer science major. That's how they were screening things. I mentioned this to a good friend of mine, Wayne Holder, one of the actually truly most gifted programmers I've ever known. And you know, I mentioned that they had the screening process to get accepted. He said, no, they're doing it wrong. He said, here's what they should do. They should set up a room and have in one corner several new state-of-the-art systems with lots of nifty software somewhere, and in another corner, a big bowl full of money. And any student can walk in there and they can either spend as much time as they want playing on the hardware, or they can grab a couple of handfuls of money and leave. I said you keep the ones who play with the hardware. And that's to the same point. It really is. It's like, yeah, I'll play with the hardware. It's like, no, I'll take the money and run. And part of the reason why computer science had exploded was that everyone thought it was kind of like the next law of medicine. Of course, now you don't go into law or medicine thinking you're going to be rich, because there are big problems with both those going. Well, but that was sort of the idea. You're going to be rich going into computer science. You're going to be the next Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. Neither of them had a degree in computer science, and frankly, Steve did not have a great technical background. And I say that as someone who knew Steve personally. So it's you're fine is what I'm saying. And yes, I'm still doing this. I've been at 45 years, 46 years almost. It was 46 years this fall since I started my degree in computer science. I still find it fascinating. I still find it interesting. And I'm still having to learn new stuff. So that's sort of what you're signing up for here. Yeah?
So if I'm in an interview and I want maybe I don't know the specific technical questions they're asking me, but I'm confident I could learn it quickly, and I'm confident I have talent in some area of computer science. How do I show that to them? What says to an interviewer like, this kid has talent?
Oh, God, I don't know. This is one of the hardest problems because frankly, a lot of the screening that's done, I think, is counterproductive. It's like, here's this puzzle. How many pizza parlors are there in Chicago? And it's like, no, just give me a book and tell me what, give me a text for the language and tell me what the problem you want to solve. I'll figure it out. Yeah.
Like I've heard like nightmares about like jokes about people asking like these questions, but like when I was interviewed with Microsoft, they asked me why are manual covers round? Like, what does that happen? Like,
How does that have to do with it?
Like, it's
They're too clever by half, and this is actually a big issue that's brought up in some of the chapters on Peopleware. Anyway, so I wish I could have a magic thing to tell you. It's you're rolling the dice every time you go in for an interview, quite frankly. You don't know what they're going to want. You don't know how they're going to screen it. The best way to prepare is to find someone who's already been, find several people who've already interviewed with them and find out what they're going to ask, and then just sort of preload for that. I wish I had a better answer for you, but this is, there's an old joke. What's the difference between a good haircut and a bad haircut? Yeah, a couple weeks. Okay? What's the difference between a good job and a bad job? About 6 months. Okay? If you get a job, you find out you got in the wrong spot, wait about 6 months and go find a new one. You can do that in this industry. You can do it right now. Now the industry has had its ups and downs. There was a big crash in the late 80s. 88, 89. Of course, there was a big dot-com crash right after 2000. But right now, for the foreseeable future, the demand is outstripping the supply. I had 4 jobs within my first 4 years after graduation. Now, I was having to do it just to stay ahead of inflation, because inflation was running in double digits per year back then, late 70s, early 80s. Change jobs. You can get away with changing jobs. In fact, if anything, people look at you if you're at a job too long in IT. So, you know, you can grin and bear anything for 6 months. I have. That was my shortest stay at any one job. And the jobs that you think are going to be great may not turn out to be great, and vice versa. So, you know, welcome to an interesting career. Okay. Now, actually getting into the lecture here. No Silver Bullet, essay written by Fred Brooks in 1986, published separately. This was 12 years after Mythical Man-Month came out. I consider this possibly the single most important essay ever written in software engineering because it addresses a problem which has existed from day one and still exists to this day. The idea that there is some magic technology or methodology which is going to solve the essential complexity of software development. Basically, there is this persistent belief that someone's going to come up with the right tools and the right methodology that will somehow negate what Armour says about invention and wrong paths. You know, whether it's AI programming, fourth generation languages, various tools, you know, this methodology, particular notation, object-oriented notations were very popular back in the 90s and so on. The truth is, if you're doing something of value, you're doing something new. If you're doing something new, you have a level of ignorance that you're just going to wrestle with. And no language, no IDE, no methodology is going to take that away. It is an essentially, software engineering is essentially a human function. It is a highly creative, highly intellectual function. And there is essential complexity, which is what Brooks is talking about here. These are his 4 inescapable essential difficulties in software development. And I ask you to believe me, these are all true. First, the complexity of a program increases non-linearly, and by non-linearly it means more than linearly, with program size, both technically and managerial. The larger your program has to be, the more complexified it is, and more than by a factor of 1. I don't know if it's a true exponential complexity, but it's just harder. And guess what? Software keeps getting bigger. When I did Sundog, Frozen Legacy on the Apple II, back in 1980, the 83, 84 time frame, it was in a 64K environment. The disk, we're using both sides of a 140K floppy disk, so we have 280K that we could use on the floppy disk, and 64K of RAM. That was it. That was the entire, actually, for a lot of it, we're developing it for 48K of RAM, because that was the standard one. And I finally talked Wayne into requiring that our customers go out and buy a 16K RAM expansion card to run a game. That's less than the size of an icon on your screen these days. Software complexity is massive. And furthermore, getting to point 2, your code must work with its ever more complex environment. You have to work with the operating system. You have to work with libraries. You have to work with languages. You have to work with other programs. You have to work with networks. There is a constant pressure to improve or fix existing systems. Remember, on maintenance, 60% of all work done on existing systems is to add features, and 40% is to fix bugs. And 60% of the amount of money spent on a given piece of software through its lifetime will be after it ships. So we tend to think of this big push and all this money is going to be spent to get the thing out the door. No, 60% will generally be spent after it ships, adding features and fixing bugs. And fourth, and we've talked about the invisibility problem, software is extremely hard to inspect and examine. Building software will always be hard. The good news is that guarantees you lifetime employment. The bad news is it will always be hard, and you will always have management that will fail to understand that, and that will seek a silver bullet. Say, oh yeah, we're just going to adopt this, and that's going to solve everything. Okay, things that do help with the complexity. Buy when you can buy. Buy an existing solution. My attitude is that if you're looking, particularly if this is an organization that's not a software vendor, but a software consumer, what you want to do is go out and find best of breed that will solve the problems that others have solved by that. Let them do the updates and the maintenance. And then if you're going to build anything, build what gives you a competitive edge in your business. There was a time 40 years ago that lots and lots of corporations built their own accounting systems from scratch. Built their own HR systems from scratch. No one does that anymore. You'd be foolish to. There's lots of off-the-shelf software, lots of software as a service that can do that. Buy the stuff that allows you to, puts you in a position to compete, and if you're going to build software within your organization, build the software that gives you the edge. That embodies the knowledge that you have that your competitors don't. He notes that requirements refinement and rapid prototyping is helpful, and incremental development is helpful. Informatics was actually, the book Informatics by John Gall was written as sort of a humorous book about system design and development, but it's actually an extremely accurate book. A large, complex system that works is inevitably found to evolve from a small, simple, that should be simple, system that works. Organizations don't believe this. They believe in big bang releases. We're going to put all the features in there, and this is basically, this is from, I think, the 80s or the 70s. This is decades ahead of extreme programming. But the best way to build a large, complex system is start with a simple system that works and make incremental improvements to it. Great designers. Now this is the area where talent can make a real difference, which is having an architecture and a design that lends itself tremendously to ongoing enhancement and to testability. If you have that, you have a true competitive edge. And the challenge, of course, is how do you find or grow great designers? And a lot of it is experience. A lot of it is talent, quite frankly, but the talent has to be mixed with sufficient experience so that the would-be architect or would-be designer knows what to do and what not to do. Any thoughts on these two slides? Yes?
Just at work today, I witnessed a conversation about buy versus build. We're trying to decide, like, on a single solution stack to build like all the different BYU websites. And we've got Vue, but then the team that I'm on wants to use Beautify to like add in like pre-made components, but then another team said, well, that's not good because we don't want to be tied down with their release cycle. We don't want to be dependent on the Beautify framework. And they said, well, we can get it faster if we buy, like and use Beautify, but we can not be dependent if we build. What would you say to the idea that being dependent on that framework is bad?
Is there a competitive advantage to building your own? Who are you competing with?
I don't know.
Yeah, well, if you're not competing with anyone, buy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, and this is, how many of you would make the decision to build a car from scratch? You know, and you all chuckle. And why are you chuckling? It's like, it's too complex. Why do it? For a fraction of the cost, I can go out and buy one. It's necessary to go out and buy a used one. Now, if I'm an automotive engineer, if I'm building a custom race car, you're darn tootin' I'm going to build that from scratch because I am going to tweak every last bit of it to get the performance I need. But if that's not my business, I'm going to go buy something off the lot, or actually off the, in my case, usually off the street. It's like, okay, you know, get a used car. I understand, and this is the temptation. It's like we might well get locked in. We won't be able to do the cool stuff we want to do. Well, no. What you want to do is let someone else worry about the bugs. I mean, my recommendation would be, unless there is some serious competitive advantage to not using this, just buy it. If worse comes to worse, at some point you can say, okay, we're going to strip it out. We're not going to use it. But too often what happens in this situation, like, well, we have better ideas. We don't want to be locked in. We can do this ourselves. And guess what happens is you spend a lot of time and money doing that solution yourself, and it isn't as good as you'd have off the shelf. And you've wasted time and resources doing that. A far better solution is just to buy the stuff off the shelf and figure out what you can do on top of that to make things just sing the way you want them to. Yeah?
Yeah, I think a great example of this idea is like I'm going to start a company right now, and there's lots of us that could build websites, but we went and contracted out the website construction to another company because it's like, why spend like the manpower that we have and someone else can do it probably better than we could.
And this is an important issue. I see this all the time. Now, the downside is when you start to get to larger companies, sometimes you have vendors or outside developers who fail at what they're doing. And so you need to sort of you need to vet who you're using and make sure what they can do makes sense. I think of a case that I testified in. It was for an ERP installation. And this particular company let it out for bid. Now, the software was third-party ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning. So they were actually bidding out to a lot of value-added resellers to come in and actually do the customization, the custom coding, configuration, and implement it. And they let out the bid to 17 companies, and 15 of them basically said, no, not going to do it, not even going to bid. Now that should have been an important piece of feedback for the customer. Because they had two companies that came back and said, okay, we'll do it. And they ended up giving the bid to one of them, and the project failed horribly. Because the company that said, yes, we can do it, turned out to lack qualified personnel, had unrealistic schedules, knew from the start that they were going to have troubles with this, but somehow thought magically it was all going to work out. And it didn't. Any other thoughts on yes?
So, it would seem to me that there's a significant difference between buying software off the shelf versus paying somebody else to build software for you.
There is.
Because I feel like buying software off the shelf is a big advantage. I feel like it's not any cheaper to pay someone else to build the software for you than to pay your own developer.
And there's a difference between someone building software for you from scratch versus someone configuring, quote, off-the-shelf software. You have, when you get to large packages like accounting systems, like enterprise resource packages and so on, often they require a lot of configuration and customization. And sometimes you hire someone outside who's very familiar with that package and knows how to do it, rather than figure out how to do that yourself. Yes?
So, I get the discussion we didn't have. I guess my concern with the buy versus build debate is the conceptual integrity of the system.
Mm-hmm.
So, right? If I go buy something and I don't know how that whole chunk of my system operates, then I've just lost visibility and some of the conceptual integrity for the overall system, right?
Yep. And what you need to do there is what we talked about in the chapter on architecture from Accelerate, which is you want to put a bubble around that commercial system that you've bought with a well-defined interface and keep your other systems that are dependent upon it sufficiently decoupled. The more tightly you couple into that, you're gonna run into that problem because and here's the big pitfall with buy versus build. You're going to buy, and if it's a large, it's one thing if you're getting Microsoft Word, okay, that's just really off the shelf. But if you're getting something like an ERP or like an accounting system, something where you've got a level of configuration or customization, then let's say you get SAP, you know, big worldwide ERP system, and you go through the whole customization and configuration process, so it's hooked up to everything, you know, accounting, HR, manufacturing, shipping, and so on. And then they release version 3.0. And you're running on 2.x, and you have all these customizations. How do you update it? That's the downside of the buy.
Wait until it hits end of life and then panic.
There you go. which actually happens quite often.
Yeah.
They continue to live on their 2.x. They continue to sort of patch us. They pay extra money to the vendor to fix certain bugs and so on, and then they reach a point where it reaches end of life and they panic. So that's exactly what happens. So this, you know, the advantage of building it yourself, of course, is that you have full control of everything. The disadvantage is you may think you have full control of everything, but you start to deal with software rot, software entropy. Changes keep getting made and pushed in there, and no one really understands the whole system. So you lose the conceptual integrity anyway. Welcome to information technology. Yes?
Just as a note on my last job, you still kind of have it even with the systems you bought, where we had people that left the company 20 years ago, hiring them to come back to look at systems that they had set up, because nobody knew how it worked. But it was vital because you turn off the server for 10 minutes and the whole thing was crumbling.
Oh, yeah.
So we had them come back as consultants, getting paid 2 or 3 times what they were being paid before.
And well, actually, yes. And there was quite humorous because back in the late 90s, there were all these retired COBOL programmers who were making enormous sums of money because they're being brought back to do Y2K remediation on these old entrenched COBOL systems that no one had touched and no one knew how to change. So no, there aren't easy answers here. And this again is why you will not see AI programming, I think, in our lifetimes. Anyway. Now, chapter 17, he talks about the reaction he had to his essay. He says that there was a lot of pushback when he published his essay in 1986. People said, well, what about this? And what about this? And this is going to solve everything. And when he wrote this chapter in 95, he basically said, guess what? Almost all those solutions that people were touting in response to my essay have gone away. The whole idea of reusable, interchangeable components. This is Brad Cox, who invented Objective-C. I'm going to do programmed in Objective-C. I have. That was what we used in Pages under the Next Step operating system. The reason it's so popular is, of course, that the Next Step operating system became Mac OS X, and Objective-C came along for the ride. The whole idea was that back in the start of the 90s, that you're going to have these reusable software components. Well, actually, you had this big reuse push in the 90s, which, as I know here, failed utterly. In 1992, Dave Farrell offered the vanilla framework, which I had never heard of until I read this chapter, so it obviously didn't do it. In my book, Pitfalls of Object-Oriented Development, I said, that object-oriented development itself was just another brass slug. It's not a silver bullet. Back in the early to mid-90s, object-oriented development was touted as, this great breakthrough. You can program 200%, 400% faster. You don't need quality assurance. And I wrote a book called Pitfalls of Object-Oriented Development, precisely to counter this hype. And the interesting thing is that the conceptual and managerial hype, as I've already mentioned, lives on in almost any new technology or methodology. If you start reading, how many of you started on Webster 7? No one. It's okay. That's, by the way, important reading for the midterm, because it's, again, a very useful cheat sheet. All you have to do is look through the pitfalls and say, oh, that sounds like something for this question. Those are taken, the pitfalls there are taken straight out of this book. All I did was, in place of saying object-oriented development or object technology, I simply said any technology or methodology. Because you see the same problems over and over again. Brooks says his analysis stands. I agree. There is no silver bullet. I see no silver bullet on the horizon. There are things that help. Buying versus building. Some of the stuff we talked about in the previous slide helps. But whatever your language, methodology, language type, tool of the day, it still boils down to the people you have. And I could get a team of really good programmers, and we could do everything in C or assembly language and still write outstanding software. Probably because we were on schedule. It's not the technology, it's the people. Any questions before we move on? Okay, now we switch over to Peopleware. You're going to be reading a lot of Peopleware over the next few weeks. This is useful for those of you who are in the middle of job interviews. It baffles me, well, no, it doesn't baffle me, but it saddens me that here in the year 2020, we still have companies, lots and lots of companies that think open workspaces enable collaboration and are a good thing for software developers. The comment here, those making work-based decisions are not themselves doing the kind of work that is likely to suffer from a poor environment. Their goals are focus, frankly, ease, flexibility, and cheapness of setting up the physical workspace. Now, is collaboration useful and essential in software development? Yes. Is isolation useful and essential? Yes. Can you achieve isolation in an open workplace setting? It's really hard. It's really hard. You have visual distractions. You have people who come out. How many of you have been programming in a situation, have been deep into your code, and have someone come up and start talking to you? And you lose the whole thing. I think I already told you the story with Wayne while I was doing Sundog, where I had, this 64K memory map loaded into my head and was trying to figure out some tricky solution. And Wayne came to my office to talk to me and asked me a question, and I turned and looked at him and would not say a word because I knew as soon as I opened my mouth and spoke, the map would go away. And so I just sort of glared at him, and he looked sort of puzzled and said something, and I just shook my head and refused to say anything, and he finally went, oh, okay, and walked away. And after I finished my work, a few hours later, I went back and said, Wayne, I had everything, and he said, okay, don't say no more, I know exactly what the problem is. He said, sorry I was bothering. But this is a truism. You're in a flow, you've got stuff floating in your head, you're juggling all this stuff, and then someone comes up and says, hey, can we talk about the sprint goals for next week? And bam, it's gone. And you have to talk to them, and then you have to start building that mental construct over again and again. This is so true. Almost without exception, the workplace given to intellect workers is noisy, interruptive, unprivate, and sterile. Now, I've already said to you that One of the things I'm most proud of at Pages was that when we closed our funding and moved to our permanent offices, permanent building, every engineer got his own office with doors. They weren't terribly big, but they were private. Now, we had areas we could hang out in, we talked a lot, we corresponded a lot, but everyone had the ability to shut their door and work. And we had basically floor-to-ceiling narrow windows on the side of each door. So people could look in and see whether anyone was there before they knocked on the door and decide whether or not to interrupt them. What has been your experience as far as workplace environments that have been detrimental to getting your work done? Yes?
Yeah, the startup company I'm at is like, it's just one open office. Like I sit next to the CEO, the CTO, everyone, and it's kind of a disaster. Like we don't know noise canceling headphones. It's so hard to focus. It's so hard to, like, and the idea is that it's just like, it's like a fun startup culture, and it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of tough.
Yeah.
I was actually going to ask you a question about what you think a good like middle ground is, because I worked in an office that was like very strict cubicles that were like really tall and you couldn't like see or talk to anyone. And I felt like that was very isolating, especially for me as an intern, that I didn't feel like I could go ask people questions because I felt very much isolated from the rest of my team. So I guess I was just wondering if you had an opinion about like a good middle ground between the two.
Well, there's a couple of different approaches, and DeMarco and Lister talk about this. One is to put, if you have teams of 2 or 3 people who are working on a project together, put them in an office. So you still don't have the whole big open environment, but you do have people who are working closely together in pairs or trios who are next to each other and can readily turn and interact. So that's going to depend in part on the person, the type of work and the nature of the person, what the person wants or doesn't need. The other thing is you do need some sort of environment in which people can mingle and talk. When you want to get out from under the stress, or just the other thing is just ask someone to lunch. I think I already told you this. We had a group of 4 programmers at Pages who would take 2-hour lunches almost every day, and I had the CFO complain to me about this. I said, A, they're working 60 hours a week. B, I know that half of what they talk about at lunch is what they're working on. I said, they can take as long a lunch as they want to, as far as I'm concerned. He never brought it up again. You had a question or a comment?
Oh, it was going off of the, I feel like a lot of people now are saying, oh, well, you have open concept, just give up on noise canceling headphones. And I feel like that is an even worse solution, because it then encourages listening to music while you're working, which I feel like for a good 50% of the population doesn't actually, is a detriment to the code.
That's an interesting point. How many of you prefer to listen to music while you're working? How many prefer silence while you're working? Look at that. It's 50-50. It really is. And the problem with noise canceling headphones is what to sit with noise canceling headphones and nothing playing feels unnatural.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes you want just a little bit of white noise, the air coming out of the vents or whatever. The other problem is you have visual distraction in the open concept. So even if you have the noise canceling headphones, you see things that are going on around you. And occasionally, if you have coworkers you have olfactory distraction, cologne, perfume, need for a shower, something like that. And you have people who are willing to just come up and talk to you, whereas if you're in an office, they wouldn't be willing to. Yes?
I was going to say, I'm on a capstone team that has a lab in the basement of a new engineering building, and there's, I don't know, 35 of us or so on the team, and the space is maybe this big, and we're all in there from 8 to 10 Monday through Friday. We get very, very little done during that time. Each team has usually there's a certain number of people on each team that will meet outside of those hours and get 10 times as much work done.
Yeah.
as some other time.
And I need to get into my files. We have a 10 by 10 storage locker filled with boxes of papers and books and everything else I need to sort through. I have a cartoon I may have mentioned before by Rich Tennant. who did a cartoon for the San Jose Mercury News in the Bay Area called Fifth Wave, which was sort of technology humor. And he had a sub-series within that called Real Programmers. One of his cartoons, which I clipped and have kept and have in my file, says, real programmers get their best work done between 1 and 3 a.m. And what it shows this building with all the lights out except for one office that still has a light on, and a little voice balloon coming out saying, oh, wow. At Pages, my best programming work at Pages was after 7 o'clock. There were other engineers around, but they all were heads down also. Management was all gone. And my best work was from 7 o'clock till about 2 in the morning. My body would get tired, so I didn't feel restless. And I'd get in a zone, and I'd sit there and program, and I'd be very productive until I started to fall asleep and make typographical errors, which is when I'd quit for the night. And I'd either go home, or during some stretches, I'd simply set an alarm on this. I had a little digital alarm that would stick to the back of my chair. I'd set the alarm for like 6 or 7, put my feet up on the desk and sleep.
Oh my gosh.
In my office, when I got up, I'd go outside and walk around the building a few times to wake up, and then go back and start programming again. It's the life of a programmer. So but you get your best work done. I mean, that's one of the chapters out of Peopleware. You know, no one gets any work done between 8 and 5 here. I think that's the title of the chapter, something to that effect. And that's why. You know, you get your work done when everyone goes away and leaves you alone. And you can think without interruption for hours. Yes?
Just to piggyback off of that, I was interning somewhere, and the same kind of thing, open layout. But I knew, even if they weren't in the same office space, even if they had their own private office, just because of the nature of the interruptions, if I had to put an email in their inbox by 9 a.m., I'd have to wait for the next business day for them to get to me, just because they always get interrupted.
Yeah. Yes?
So this just reminds me, when I was working at Microfocus, management decided they wanted to make all the support teams more open. So we each had our own office, and they required an open door policy so that anyone could come into our office anytime. And I just ignored it because, frankly, it just was too distracting to hear people walking up and down and hear the clacking of everyone else's keyboards in the office across from mine. So,
Yep.
Yeah.
Someone else? Yeah.
I was going to ask, Heidi, what do you think about people that work remotely that come home?
Well, actually, my daughter Crystal does that. She does it very effectively. She doesn't do it full time. She does it a couple days a week. And it's actually, she says that's her most productive time precisely because no one can interrupt her. And she's, she's home with her dog. And she'll just sit there at work. And it's quite quiet. I think that's a good way of getting isolation. I can tell you, having been self-employed for 20 years, the problem with working at home is having the discipline to actually get the work done, as opposed to, you know, going on social media or seeing what's on Netflix or whatever. And as a development approach, if it's something you're doing a few days a week, and you can still come in for meetings, that's good. If there's real physical separation, it's hard to make it work unless you really have a small team who are all pretty much on the same wavelength. At Pages, my sister Deirdre was one of the software engineers. And a couple of years into development, her husband, who was a Navy pilot, became the executive officer of the XO at Pensacola Naval Air Station in Florida. And we were in San Diego. So she stayed on the payroll. We partitioned off tasks that we could give her to do that didn't require a lot of interaction. We're back to the accelerate concept, you know, something where she's got clearly identified APIs so she can do stuff. And for 2 years, she basically worked remotely. And she would fly back out to San Diego about once every 4 to 6 weeks. But she said it really impacted her negatively. She felt out of the loop. She didn't have the casual conversations. She had a hard time keeping up on sort of the issues that we were debating about regarding the software, and she felt very isolated. Now, this was back in the early 90s. It was before Slack. I mean, we had email. But it was before the web. It was before Slack. I think there are tools now that make it more feasible, but there is still a problem if you have a truly distributed development group. You need very focused people who, like I said, are already on the same wavelength as far as what's being done to keep things from fracturing. Because you run into Conway's login, and now the communication channel is the level of isolation, so each person becomes his own independent unit. Told you it's going to be a long lecture. Still got a ways to go here. Okay, chapter 8. You never get anything done around here between 9 and 5. There we go. And we'll take a biology break at the top of the hour, but that's fine. Go ahead. Anyway. Overtime. Oh man. I worked overtime. I worked massive overtime. At Pages, I averaged probably 60 to 70 hours a week for the first 3.5 years. I was chief architect. I was the chief technical officer for a startup. There were weeks I put in where I worked 100 hours that were just ahead of key deadlines. We're trying to demo something or get something working and so on. I'm not sure if I would do that again. It was an enormous cost on my family. We had a lot of kids at home, and my wife basically had to deal with them because I was gone almost all the time. And the problem with a lot of overtime is you often don't get more work done. What happens is your day ends up getting filled up with meaningless stuff or less meaningful stuff like meetings and interruptions and so on and so forth, and then you're getting useful work done at night. And that's not fair to your developers, and it's not fair to the developer families. Now here's an interesting thing. There is, DeMarco and Lister note that individual differences in terms of productivity. You'll see a number of figures quoted. 10 to 1 is not a bad one. 5 to 1 as far as productivity of individual developers. Organizations have the same differences. You have highly productive organizations and highly unproductive organizations. One of the things that DeMarco and Lister found is that the best performing organizations, their top performers, had space that was quieter, more private, better protected from interruption, and larger. If you want your people to be productive, this is what you do. You give them an environment and a workflow and a work schedule that encourages productivity. Frankly, it's why flex time is very useful for developers. It's why the ability, as per the earlier question about working from home. Again, my daughter Crystal is very productive when she works from home. She only does it a couple days a week. But it's where she does her sort of personal development sprints because no one bothers her. Or she can ignore it. She may see emails or stuff coming in on Slack, and she can just, ignore it for now and keep working. And then she goes in and does all the interactions and so on and so forth. Any observations on this? How many of you have been, oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, I watched the Extreme Programming podcast, and in that he said that lots of overtime is a problem with your organization.
Yeah.
But he didn't explain why. Why is that?
Well, for starters, it usually signals that the goals are unrealistic. You're acquiring overtime, you're trying to get stuff accomplished in a time frame that doesn't make sense. Now, here's the reality. If you're doing a startup, especially if it's a sweat equity startup, you've got deadlines, you've got to start, getting income somehow, you're trying to meet certain market needs and conditions, you'll find yourself doing overtime. I've done 2 startups, I've done overtime in both of them. The interesting thing, and I've already mentioned this with Sundog, I did 100-hour sprints also, and by the time I released version 2.0 of Sundog, I quit a week later and did not program for 4 years. I was so burned out. I had job offers, and I was considering them, and I panicked at the thought. It was literally a sense of panic, having to go back and do programming again. I had the great good fortune and blessing of having another career to fall back on. I've been writing on the side, and was able to leverage that into full-time income. And then when I moved up here a year later, I was teaching at BYU as well, so between teaching and writing, I could support myself. And I slowly worked my way back into programming. Now the interesting thing is I actually worked longer. My time at Oasis FTL was only about 2 years. Is that right? Let's see. Yeah, middle of August 82 to October 84, and I was burned out and didn't program for 4 years. Pages was 5 years. I was chief technical officer. Like I said, worked 60 to 70 hours a week for the first 3.5 years. My reward to myself when we finally shipped after 3.5 years was I stopped coming in on weekends. I stayed home on weekends. But up till then, I had been working every weekend. And I didn't burn out. Now, after we closed, because the market wasn't there, we had saturated the next market and ran out of money before we could port over Windows. Some of the engineers were starting a new startup and invited me to come along, and I said, no thanks. And I moved into consulting, and basically been doing consulting ever since. So part of the burnout will depend upon what your circumstances. Now the thing is, at Pages, I was chief technical officer, chief software architect. I had a lot of power and influence, quite frankly. And so what I was doing because I was choosing to do it, and I knew the outcome was in the direction that I wanted. Any questions on this? Yes?
So talking about like the whole interruptions thing, one of my least favorite things about working at Microfocus as well was these like monthly not even just monthly, like they had these like social activities and stuff that you were forced to go to. And it was always at the worst time when I was finally starting to do something. So how do we find that? I imagine there's a good reason that they were doing that. Like how do you find that balance between like making a unified company, I guess, and like not getting in people's way?
That's actually a very good question. It's a trickier problem. We had some social activities at Pages, but they were more organic. We would do very large, about once a month. We would do company lunches where they'd bring in catered barbecue or stuff from El Pollo Loco or whatever, and we'd just all gather around and eat lots of food and laugh and scratch, and then all go back to work. That was nice. We as engineers the engineering team had our own offsite to go see Terminator 2 when it came out in the theaters. Mostly the ooh and ah of the computer graphics. So it's and we had a few other self-organized within the engineering team stuff. The socialization is nice, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't feel artificial or forced. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. And you don't want to do it in a way that interrupts. You want to basically let people know ahead of time and say, just block out this day and we're all going to the beach or something. Beach here, but let's all go to the beach. Let's go to Hawaii. Hey, I wrote for Macworld magazine for a couple of years, and they had great offsites. We did one in Cozumel down in Mexico, and we did one out in Hawaii. They were both, all expense paid, flows out there,
Yeah.
had a great time for, had meetings and planning stuff and so on. Basically had a good time for a couple of days. It was great. Yes?
Just kind of a side note off that, one of the things you shouldn't do is have the CFO come up and tell all the development support staff what the company's financial goals are. That just feels like the biggest waste of time. It doesn't apply at all to what you're doing. Oh my
This
gosh.
just gets back to sort of the carrot and stick thing. Now, as a senior staff member at Pages, we had senior staff meeting every week, and our CFO, John Curry, love the man, have great respect for him, learned a lot from him, would have, as I mentioned, a spreadsheet, said, okay, here's our month-by-month burn rate, here's where we run out of money. So we either need more money or to cut our expenses, not to close on this particular date. That was a tremendous education for me professionally, but it wasn't anything I felt the need to share with the engineers. They were all head down. They were all just working as fast as they could. So yeah, I think telling the engineers the financial goals is kind of like, go away. We just want to get our software right. Saving money on space, this is just more of the same. This is the interesting one. Correlation between perceived noise level and defects in work. Software developers who were producing 0 defects, 2/3 of them said the noise level was okay. Those who were reporting 1 or more defects, only 8% said the noise level was okay. It's hard to stress the problem that distraction gives you. I mean, we've already talked some about flow. How many of you have experienced programming flow, where you get in the zone, and it's just going and going and going?
Is that the official term for it?
Flow? Flow is a term that's actually, yes, used in literature. You can come up with other terms. The flow, the zone, whatever it is. But it's that sense where, as I mentioned with my story about Sundog, where you've got everything loaded into your brain. And you're working on stuff. And you can just sort of see everything, and okay, I've got to change this over here, and because I'm changing this, I've got to change this over here, and so on. And then someone comes and, hey, Webster, I need to talk to you about something. It goes poof. And it's going to take me 2 hours to get that all loaded into my brain again.
Is there a way for a programmer to more efficiently enter the coding flow?
That's a good question. I don't know. There may be. Any thoughts? Yes.
Take lots of showers.
Take lots of showers?
No one deserves you to shower.
Ah, there you go.
2-hour-long showers.
I think it's consistency. I always load up the same playlist, and that playlist kind of like references me back to like, oh, this is like the flow playlist. Like I'm used to this sound, so I get quicker into the flow because I'm used to it.
That's very interesting. I still do that to this day, but mostly I'm doing it with writing. I have my white noise playlists that I would listen to, and they're very unusual. One is the complete Peer Gynt, not the suite, but the complete operetta in Norwegian. And I can load that up, and it immediately blocks everything else out. Another is the complete works of the Moody Blues in chronological order. I was a big Moody Blues fan back in high school. I'm still a big Moody Blues fan. But I can put on Nights in White Satin, and everything else just sort of fades away. I have a similar playlist that's the chronological complete list of Elton John. I have one that's Lord of the Rings soundtracks in order, one that's Star Wars soundtracks in order. And it is that thing. I can turn that on, and it seems to shut down a lot of the distractions, and I'm able to focus far more quickly. Yeah.
So on that, I also use like Baroque music in particular.
Yeah.
Good set of headphones, but I've also found a clean desk can really help just because there's less to look at all around you. Try and segment yourself off as best you can. Walls.
Oh. So, saving money on space. Again, claims of productivity and interaction for open space just don't work, quite frankly. And cost of workspace is a small cost for the cost of a developer. And particularly for the cost of something being linked. I've already told you that conversation I had decades ago from someone with a successful software company down in San Diego. In this case, he was talking about software development, hardware, and tools. How many of you have worked at a job where the computers they give you are less than state of the art? They're slow, they're low on disk space, they're low on memory. This gentleman said, I realized at some point that I literally could not spend more on hardware and software for my developers than I would lose by them being a simple month late in delivering. It is a false economy. That's true with space, that's true with offices, that's true with hardware and software tools. Frankly, in my opinion, it's true with training. We will talk at some point here about education and training. I mean, how many of you would kill to be able to go to, say, 3 conferences of your choice each year? You know, and see stuff. This is a great way to learn stuff. Great way to network, great way to get familiar with things. And companies say, well, we don't want them learning this new stuff because then they'll leave us. How many of you ever left a job so you could go learn new stuff? Yeah. And you'll find that once you're out there, you're going to do that more often. Okay, yeah. Brain time versus body time. Here's the talk about flow, deep, meditative involvement, sense of euphoria, unaware of passage of time. How many of you have been programming and you look up and you think it's been 30 minutes and it's been 4 hours? Yeah, that's flow. You know, it's like, oh yeah. It's midnight? Wait, what? Of course, now I mostly do that playing XCOM, but you know, hey. They talked about the telephone. Now, all of you have learned at a young age to ignore phone calls anyway, so. But you do have social media, you do have Slack, or you know, whatever your social environment du jour is. And it can be distracting. Bring back the door. We talked about this. A lot of this is sort of repetitive. Now, important point here, like Windows doors are frequently a status symbol, and therefore if everyone can't have one, it should be one, not no. Nobody can have one. Workers aren't inspired or made more productive because the open workplace has fashionable or daring or amusing design. Oh, we're going to do this, you know, fancy stuff. We've got these cute things up on the wall and so on. It's like, no, give me a door and, you know, go away. Leave me alone. Keep programming. Taking umbrella steps. No. I assume you read that. Okay. Making work sustainable. Let's talk about fighting to reduce burnout, and then we'll take a break. And then we'll come back and do roll and talk about the Webster things. I told you it's going to be a long lecture today. Burnout can be real. I experienced it. Like I said, for 4 years, I basically couldn't program for a living. And was extremely fortunate that I had something else I could do to support my wife and kids. The organizational culture. Remember our chart from Accelerate with the 3 types of culture? You want a friendly's not the right word, but you want a culture that encourages and rewards creativity, problem solving, and frankly, failure. Biggest problem, as someone who acts as an expert witness on failed software projects, one of the single biggest problems is that projects don't fail fast enough. They're kept on life support for years after they should have been shut down. And so what might have been, okay, this is a failed project and we lost $2 million, becomes, oh, this is a failed project and we've lost another 3 years and another $40 million. That's what happens. It's a belief, this one more slip, this next 6 months or 12 months, we'll get it done, we'll get it into production. We just have to spend the money and spend the time. and it fails anyway. Reduce or eliminate deployment pain. And they talked about this earlier as far as how painful actually pushing a system into deployment can be. Now this sort of is assuming a DevOps or a more frequent release schedule. If you're on a more traditional where you're releasing like, once a year, then the deployment pain just seems to be just sort of baked into everything. It's like, okay, we have to release this by the end of the third quarter 2020, and you already know ahead of time. If you're doing daily releases or weekly releases, then you've got more of the deployment pain, and the question is, have you things set up so that you can do the testing, so that you can get stuff done, and so on. Hire and empower effective leaders, which means leaders who actually are taking care of the people working for them and inspiring them, not threatening them, or trying to squeeze every last bit of work out of them. Invest in best practices wisely. Training and pilot projects, and we've talked about this some, we're going to continue to talk about it. It gets back to the silver bullet concept. It's like, functional programming is going to solve all our problems. We're going to adopt a functional programming language. Getting laughter here. Bring it up. And no one has any experience in it, but we're going to adopt this for our mission critical project, which is due in 3 months. That happens. That happens. It's like, no, you do a pilot project. You actually send your developers to training on it. You say, okay, let's see if this works. Let's see if this is actually the best solution. Companies don't want to make that investment, and they crash and burn as a result. Now, for Accelerate, their argument is that a continuous delivery and lean organizational practice gets you less deployment pain and less burnout. I haven't personally worked in a DevOps situation, so I can't give you any personal observations on that. But to the extent that you are doing daily development, daily releases, automated testing, and small incremental changes, I think that that's going to be largely true because you're never pushing towards a big deadline. It's just each day, yeah.
So when they talk about like high frequencies of delivery, that's like at least multiple times a week?
Yeah, if not a day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just kind of my observation on that, I'm trying to move towards more of a continuous delivery that you set up in the work I'm doing. And it seems to me that what you're trying to do is force yourself to do the things you're afraid of and do them frequently until you have them completely automated so that those things that were painful, you're forced to focus on making them not painful.
And we're going to talk about that in one of the Webster articles, referring to difficult. Let's take, can we do a 5-minute break? 5-minute biology break for those who want it. Let's start again at 20 after. We'll take roll. And we've just got the Webster articles, which we'll go through relatively quickly. But hey, again, this is a week's worth of lectures in one sentence. As asked before, how many of you have ever been swimming in a lake or even in the ocean and suddenly hit a big temperature differential? Like in a lake, the top couple feet are really warm and then it's like ice cold underneath. Yeah.
Does that like keep the oxygen from the top part going to the bottom?
Well, it can actually cause problems with mixing. And in the ocean, with sharp thermocline, there will be plankton that won't be able to rise above the thermocline. So you'll have stuff that will drift down from above, but stuff from below can't rise up, which is why I first thought of this while I was working as a contract programmer at Apple. Because this is what I was observing, was that the people in the trenches, this was my first real realization of this in a large organization, people in the trenches knew how things were going or not going, and the upper levels of management were oblivious. The information was not going up. What I've since found is that this is nearly universal. It doesn't happen in all organizations. There are organizations that take steps to avoid this, but the general rule is that only good news flows uphill. And so as you go up each level of management, some of the bad news gets sort of filtered out. And you have just sort of more and more just good news coming up. This is a serious issue with most software projects, because it means that upper management doesn't know, and quite honestly often doesn't want to know how things are really going. All they want to hear is sometimes the core problem is upper management only wants to hear good news. They punish bad news. There's a management maxim, I don't want to hear about problems, I don't want to hear about solutions. It's like, well, guys, you're the upper management. These solutions involve you, so let me tell you about the problems, because we're not going to ship. So that, why do you have this barrier? Well, you have, first, that upper management often punishes bad news and rewards good news. And so all they get is good news, until it is unavoidable. Remember, I told you the 3-week rule, which I thought was some clever observation by me until I found that Fred Brooks mentioned it in Mythical Man-Month, that the upper management tends to find out the true state of the software project and slip the schedule 3 weeks before the deadline. And basically 3 weeks is when the bad news, what you have, the closer you get to the deadline, this keeps shifting more and more up to the top, to where the truth is because you can't hide it anymore. I've already told you the story, I'm pretty sure, but you're going to hear it again. When I got dragged into Y2K remediation at Fannie Mae, all the remediation was supposed to be done by the end of 1998. Carol Teasley, who was vice president I was working with there, had company-wide meeting with all the heads of all the different divisions each week. And all through the second half of 98, it was, red, yellow, green reporting status. Everyone was green with a few yellows. And their first meeting in December, all of a sudden everything went yellow and red. And Carol looked around the room and said, "Tell me what you know now that you didn't know a week ago." Because all of a sudden, stuff that had been reported as green for months went yellow or red. In some cases, it was division heads who were being overly optimistic, thinking, "Oh, I'll just tell them everything's going fine and we'll catch up somehow." And in some cases, they just weren't getting accurate information until it couldn't be hidden anymore. So you have lack of true metrics, that is objective, automated, predictive metrics on product status, excessive optimism on the part of engineers, self-protection on the part of managers going up the chain, and top management tends to reward good news and punish bad news. How many of you have seen this, where you're down in the trenches and you know the project's not going well, and upper management seems to think everything's hunky-dory?
There was a saying around my office, the crap goes downhill.
Yeah.
And that was a big, big problem, because even if you weren't necessarily punished, you were left with a mess to clean up.
Yep. Has anyone else, this I've told you already that when I go in, when I'm asked to come in and review a troubled project, that what I do is I spend the first several days just interviewing the engineers in the trenches. And usually after about the 10th interview, I can tell you exactly what's wrong, where the problems are. And it's not any magic stuff on my part. I just asked them. I said, "Why isn't the project going well?" "Well, it says this and this." And then I tell that to upper management, they're willing to listen to me because they're paying me, $250 an hour or whatever to be a consultant. But they're not willing to listen to their engineers down in the trenches who tell them the same thing for free. And would gladly tell them if they just ask them and listen to them. That was when I first started doing project consulting at OSG. This was what I'd shake my head about. Because I considered myself an excellent software engineer and software architect. And I remember turning to one of my fellow consultants at OSG and say, the irony here is that these companies are not paying me these big consulting fees to do what I'm really good at, which is software architecture and design. They're paying me to tell them what anyone could find out with, you know, an hour worth of conversation down in the trenches. Trust me, a lot of consulting runs on that concept. But shh, don't tell anyone. The consequence, again, as the deadline draws near, the actual project status moves upward the chain, and then you get the project slip 3 weeks before. How to avoid the thermocline? I'll go straight to this point. Upper management should be actively seeking out from the lower levels realistic feedback on it and rewarding honest feedback. Not making them scared, not punching it. You want honesty and outspokenness, and you want to reward it, and avoiding the temptation of the quick fix to ship. And that's the other thing, is that it's kind of like, oh, we're in trouble. Well, what are the 3 things we need to do that we can just get this into production? I've mentioned this project, I was called in, I led a team. It was a big re-engineering project at a big financial firm. It was supposed to take 2 years and cost $180 million, and when I came in, they'd spent 4 years on it, they'd spent $500 million, and they had 0 code in production. And we spent 3 months going through it, and their question was, what's it going to take us to get us into production? And we spent 3 months going through this with, in great detail. And I came back and basically said, well, there's whole sections that you'll need to rewrite and fix. You don't have an architecture, you don't have QA organization, and so on. And my understanding is that the project continued to lurch forward for a few more years, spent a few more $100 million, and had some small portions of it go into production. For like $700 million. It was just depressing. Yes?
So a lot of what we've talked about in this class so far pertains directly toward management and how they can run things better. So what tips can you give us as those lowly engineers in the trenches that nobody listens to help improve some of these things in our given workplace?
Look for a better job. Sometimes that's a solution. Sometimes something I discovered, and this was something I learned in Pages, because and again, I was actually sort of upper management, but things that seemed obvious to me, I thought were obvious to others. And then when we got into a big slip, I realized, no, that wasn't the case. And I developed a technique that, and I'm pretty sure I've mentioned here before, where I would think, okay, this is the point of information I need to get out. To try and propagate the information upwards, to change things. I'm not going to change how the managers manage. They're not going to listen to me, even if I'm chief technical officer. They're going to do what they're going to do. So what I do is I pick one important point of information and then start to go around to people at all levels. And in conversations, I just say, this wasn't one of Pages, but I say, I think we should try to move towards fully automated testing. And I just put it out there, and people would agree or disagree or whatever. And I wouldn't engage them in that. I would just simply state, but I'd keep doing it. And I'd go to as many different people in the organization, and I'd keep saying it. What I discovered is after a while, I'd start to hear people say it to each other. And Dave Creek is saying, yeah, I think we should go to fully automated testing. And, Larry, the CEO, yeah, that might be a good idea. Then I pick the next item and move on to that. This is a very effective technique for trying to spread stuff. Now, if it doesn't always work, and if it doesn't work, then that's not going to change. But the point is, don't make it about ego or power or position. Just make the assertion and keep making it until you hear people start to echo it to each other. And if it doesn't work within the organization, then I've quit jobs because I didn't like how the management worked. This is a reality regardless of your profession. Stories of bad management aren't unique to information technology. They're ubiquitous. Sometimes you wonder how people got into the management positions they got into. And quite seriously, it's like, and sometimes it's, you know, I've had friends who've worked in technology companies where someone was hired in a senior management position, not because of any particular qualifications, because quite literally they were the cousin of the CEO. And they did a wretched job and did a lot of damage and eventually got eased out of that position. Don't assume that management is necessarily skilled or rational in what they're doing. They may well be. And I've worked for some outstanding people and people I'd go work for again in a heartbeat, but I've also worked for some people who I would not work for again. Yes?
Just on that line, just kind of a response, and also I'd love your thoughts about this. I've also experienced kind of a weird management culture where, you know, the gospel truth is productivity. Not necessarily deadlines, but I want to know that you're working. So, you know, that's what makes you a good worker. And what I found was a mistake I made was being willing to tell the bad news and say, I don't know what the schedule is going to be because I don't know what I don't know. And I found that what I think would have made a big difference is to actually say that, but also talk up, you know, sell myself. And so I think there may be another aspect to this while you're telling the managers, you know, no, this isn't realistic, or here's what the problems are. But at the same time, my people are actually working extremely well.
And here's, you hit a key point, and this is a perennial divide between management and engineering. Management almost always comes from a business background. And we've already talked, I think we talked last week about the experience, you know, where someone says, can you make your program do X? And you sit down and in 30 minutes like, yeah, bam, it does X. And they say, well, can you make it do Y? And you say, no, I can't. It'll take months. And they don't understand that. And they think that you're trying to shine them on. They think you're trying to be deceptive, and they see your Nerf guns, and they see the little figurines you have on your desks, and, you know, the wallpaper on your computer screen, and they think these guys are a bunch of kids who are trying to shine us on. And they don't, we're unreliable wizards, basically is how they see us. And sometimes the magic works, and sometimes it doesn't. And they think that it's all a negotiation on our part. And trust me, this is true. This is absolutely true. And it's. I have somewhere in my files a cartoon from Datamation magazine from the 70s that illustrates exactly that same concept. It's someone taking, it's a CEO taking someone on a tour of his company, and it's like, yeah, here's our stenography pool, and here's our, you know, accounting department, and here's our sales department. Everyone's squared away in neat cubicles and everything else. And they walk by a thing that says, you know, data processing, and the guy says, well, what's in there? And the CEO looks a little concerned and says, well, yeah, let's take a look. And he opens the door, and there's one guy in a lotus position in front of his terminal with incense burning, and, you know, someone else with long hair doing something weird, and so on. And that is how management tends to see IT. We are unreliable wizards. The magic doesn't always work. Now, we know why it works and why it doesn't work, but they have a hard time understanding it. They don't grasp the reality of armor, and also they don't grasp that sometimes what you have built allows one thing but doesn't allow another. I had this argument with Larry Spellhog at Pages for months because he suddenly decided he wanted headlines that could be arbitrarily rotated. And I said, Larry, that was never part of the architecture, it was never part of the design. He says, well, why can't you just put it in there? I said, Larry, you don't realize how much work it would take to get that one feature in there. And I think he always thought I was shining him on. It's like, no, Larry, really, it's not going to be easy. Yeah.
It seems to me like a lot of the problems you talked about would be solved by putting someone with a coding background in management.
Oh yeah. This is actually, and where you'll see this with startups, usually one or two of the top people is a technology person. Sometimes they all are. And so they understand this. And what you have is you have, once a company is established, the founder gets a chief science officer or chief technical officer or, you know, company fellow and gets shoved to one side, and you have management come in. And they don't have a coding background. Or worse yet, you will find as you go out there that the CXO position that tends to be most disrespected, and probably for good reason, is CIO, Chief Information Officer. Because often CIOs are people with business backgrounds who have a little coding experience and don't know nearly as much as they think they do. And so they make grand assertions and think they can do things, and the business-oriented people don't tend to respect them as much, and technology people don't tend to respect them as much. It's a pretty thankless job. There tends to be a lot of high turnover in CIO positions. Anyway, so that's the thermocline of truth. Trust me, you will see this for the rest of your career. Okay, anatomy of a runaway project. I assume you guys actually read this memo. I'm not going to go over it. That's a real memo I wrote. This was the third time I had reviewed this project in 3 years. And each time, the first two, they just kept ignoring my recommendations. And the third time I went in, it was, you know, we had some senior level mentors, architects, engineers in there, who were from this is with the company, I was in OSG. And we had some of our top people in there who kept talking back to Tony, the president, saying, this project is about to go off a cliff. It's a train wreck. And so I came in the third time, did this review, and it was a train wreck. And the company would not accept or know that it was a train wreck, and I wrote the memo. What you see is the actual memo I wrote that was delivered to the senior vice president over the project with actual names in there. And again, we were thanked, and they implemented nothing of what we said, and a year later, the project was shut down, and the senior vice president was fired. And the company had spent $10 million in 4 years and had nothing to show for it. This happens all the time. Actually, 10 million is kind of low compared to a lot of project failures these days. I have a site, if I think I'll post a link on Slack. Several years ago, the U.S. Air Force has never been able to balance its books. It has like 130 different accounting systems that don't know how to talk to each other. And so they started this project that they were going to have a universal accounting system for the entire U.S. Air Force. And they spent several years and $1 billion and abandoned it without getting any benefit out of it. And interestingly enough, in the actual after-action report analyzing what went wrong, a big issue raised was the thermocline of truth. That mid-level managers were punished or discouraged from trying to tell upper management what was actually going on. The other problem was the whole financing and staffing cycle within the Air Force was such that there was never every one person in charge. We're back to conceptual unity, project management 101. There was no one in charge of the overall architecture, no one in charge of the overall project. And instead they spent several years and $1 billion and got nothing out of it. Septic code. We've talked a little about code quality. Sometimes projects code themselves into the sewer. That is, the code itself is so, it's not even that, well, sometimes it is that individual code is really bad. Sometimes it's that the overall design is so disjointed and uncoordinated that you just can't make the code work. You literally have to throw the whole thing out and start over again. And projects don't like to do that. There are times when Fred Brooks, plan to throw one away is exactly the appropriate approach. You're better off throwing the whole thing out, starting over. A lot of the failed projects that I work on as an expert witness, that ends up being what the company does. They finally fire the original developer. They go out and get someone new who starts from scratch and successfully develops a project and deploys it, and on budget and in a reasonable time frame. We're back to the point that there's a lot of people out there writing code who shouldn't be out there writing code. A lot of people doing architecture shouldn't be doing architecture. A lot of companies don't know how to tell good developers from bad developers. And you end up with a code base that is just sick. It's infected. And you can try and push it and push it and push it to get it to ship. Or you can throw it out and start over again. Any questions on it? Have any of you seen code that you looked at and said, this is so bad, it just needs to be nuked and start over again? I get a few nods. Yeah. I mean, I have. I mean, we've talked about some of that. Where you just, yeah.
So, I have to be careful. NDAs and things.
Arrow. Back on the record. No, it's a real issue. And you're going to run into this. Now, this gets back to something someone else was bringing up earlier. I mean, how many of you have started to write a program and you're using a nice IDE and some UX, UI tools and so on, and you get the user interface mocked up and put up the windows and menus or the icon or the layout of the app or whatever very quickly, and you feel like you've made a lot of progress. This is what we do, and it's that rush of the early days of the software product. Yes, we've got it up. Yes, we know how we want this to look. Yes, we're tweaking this and it's doing all. And it all seems to go fine. And then you get to that magical, oh yeah, we're about 80% done. There's just a few things we need to do. And it's like, Titanic hitting the iceberg. You suddenly just are running into more and more difficult problems. It is our nature to defer the difficult problems, to defer the hard problems. And we tend to defer all of them. And we do all the easy stuff, and we get everything to what we think is 70 or 80% done. And then we have a whole set of hard problems all at once. And it's like trying to sift walnuts through a sifter. You mix walnuts in with a bunch of flour and you put it in the sifter and you go like this and all the flour falls right through. And it doesn't matter how much you shake that sifter, the walnuts just sit there. You've got to pull each one out and pound it to powder to get it through the sifter. That's what we tend to do. And as I note here, part of the problem of doing this is you can find yourself in solution deadlock. You've deferred 3 or 4 or 5 hard problems, and you've coded a lot of stuff till then, and you say, okay, for problem 1, we're going to have to do X, but to solve problem 2, we're going to have to do Y, and X and Y are incompatible. And to make them compatible, we're going to have to start backing up and undoing design and implementation decisions and architectural decisions possibly we've been making all the way. Yes?
So the way that this is presented kind of makes it seem like the front end doing it first might be bad. Is that true?
Well, no, because you want your customer feedback and everything else, but you need to identify the hard problems up front, and you need to have someone working on it. I've mentioned that at Pages, one of the things I did that was really smart was that, was using design models, and I mentioned that I asked Vic Spindler, the graphic designer, I said, give me the weirdest, most difficult design model that we're likely to actually try and ship. And he did. This was the April model for April Greiman. And everything I was doing from architecture, design, implementation, I always had to come back and make April work. And this was my nightmare. It had round headlines and text had to curve around it and things laid out quite differently, and You know, everything else is like, yeah, bam, 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 it falls out. Let's, okay, I have to make April work. I've got to back up, I've got to do this differently, I've got to allow this, I've got to have this function. And it made the architecture and the design so much better because we tackled that hard problem. And if we had not done that, we would never have been able to do something like April. Now, if Larry had asked me to do, you know, twirling headlines at the very start, we would have had that too. The problem there was he was asking me for that while we were like, you know, 90% done. It's like, no, Larry, this breaks too many things. We don't want to do this. That's that. Long lecture, but an important one. This is all stuff to remember. Let me take roll real